Hello friends, welcome to the HFY Ode, where we bring you new science fiction stories, a new world, a new adventure. And yes, there is no robotic or AI voices here, only real human voices with real human touch. So let's start this journey, and please subscribe my channel if you like the stories and press the bell icon for the latest updates. Let's have a story. Okay.
The humans arrived at Conclave Spire the way they always did. Wrong. Not wrong in any way I could file a procedural complaint about. Not wrong in any way that would hold up before the arbitration panel or merit a footnote in the station's intake log. Wrong in the way that a sound is wrong when it comes from a direction you were certain was empty. Wrong the way a smell is wrong when it doesn't match the room you're standing in. I watched them come through the umbilical corridor from Gate 17, 4 of them, small by most galactic standards, wrapped in the dark formal where their species favors for occasions like this. Conclave Spire receives delegations from 41 recognized civilizations. I have stood at this same observation window for 6 of the 9 sessions held here since the Spire's founding, and I have watched representatives of species far older, far larger, and far more decorated than humanity make that same walk from Gate 17 to the receiving hall. Not one of them ever walked it like they owned the asteroid. The humans didn't swagger. That's not what I mean. The female at the front, I had her file. I knew her name, Elena Voss, Chief Diplomatic Attaché, 43 years of age, which in human terms meant she was somewhere past the midpoint of whatever brief candle they're allotted. Walked with the specific unhurried quality of a person who had already decided how this would end and found the current moment only mildly interesting by comparison. I breathed in slowly through my rostral filters. 312 years of diplomatic work, 11 contested border resolutions, 4 full civilizational treaties that are still, to this day, holding. I have sat across from the Keth Dominion at the height of their expansionist period. I have personally mediated between species who communicated exclusively through bioluminescent threat displays and species who communicated exclusively through lawyers. I had never once, in 312 years, felt the particular quality of unease I was feeling right now. The wrong kind of wrong, the kind that doesn't announce itself. I stayed at the window longer than I needed to. Velm was in the attaché office when I found him, surrounded by the document towers that accumulate in the hours before any major session like sediment around a slow-moving thing. He is young by Velthari reckoning, barely past his first century, which means he still reads physical documents with his full attention rather than the practiced half-focus the rest of us have cultivated over decades of necessary tedium. He looked up when I entered. The fine sensory filaments along his crest lifted slightly, his tell, the one he has never successfully suppressed, indicating he'd clocked my expression and was already recalibrating whatever he'd been planning to say. Good boy. I folded myself onto the resting perch by the secondary console and was quiet for a moment. Velm waited. This is one of the things I value most about him. He has learned that my silences are not invitations to fill them. The humans are here, I said finally. He made a small sound of acknowledgement. I know. I processed their arrival credentials an hour ago. The lead attaché has an interesting file. Interesting. That was one word for it. Elena Voss had spent the first 11 years of her diplomatic career posted to what her species classified as hardship assignments. Contested regions, failing negotiations, the kinds of postings that either made a diplomat or quietly ended them. She had then spent the following 32 years doing something that her file described as advisory work, but which, when I read between the entries, looked considerably more like architectural work, building things. Slow things, things that wouldn't be visible for a long time. She was 43 years old. Her species rarely reached 90. Something about that kept snagging in my thinking like a loose filament catches on a rough surface. They seem very calm, I said, for a delegation walking into a Dravosi-chaired session. Velm's crest moved again, the considered version this time, not the reactive one. That's probably nerves, Senior S. Sarath. I've read that humans suppress visible distress signals when under observation. They default to neutral presentation under threat. It's a predator-derived behavior. Stillness as camouflage. I looked at him for a moment. That was a reasonable analysis. It was well-sourced, biologically accurate, and almost certainly wrong. I didn't say that. I let him have it. Sometimes the useful thing about a junior colleague's confident wrongness is that it clarifies exactly what you yourself believe. What I believed was this: Elinor Voss had not looked like a predator holding still. She had looked like someone who had already eaten. Ambassador Krail of the Dravosi Empire had the kind of face that had learned, over a long career, to express absolutely nothing while communicating total contempt. It was a diplomatic skill, technically. I had watched him deploy it across 16 sessions over the past 40 years, and I was willing to concede it was effective in the same way that a slow leak in a hull is effective. You don't notice it until you're already losing atmosphere. He opened the first session with a documentation challenge. Not a substantive one, a procedural one. Humanity's territorial claim along the Seavith corridor had been filed using a form standard that the Conclave had quietly deprecated 18 months prior. The updated standard required 3 additional verification annexes. The human delegation had filed under the old standard. Technically, this meant their claim was improperly submitted. Technically, this meant it could be set aside pending resubmission. Technically, this meant the entire session could be adjourned. The filing window would lapse, and humanity would need to start the process again from the beginning. A process that, from beginning to first session, took 11 years. Krail delivered this information the way a surgeon delivers a terminal prognosis, clinically, with the faint suggestion that the outcome was regrettable but entirely the patient's own fault for not taking better care. I watched Elinor Voss across the table. She nodded once, made a small note on the document surface in front of her, and then looked up at Krail with an expression so serene it briefly made me wonder if something had gone wrong with her higher cognition. "We'll file the updated annexes," she said. "We request a 72-hour administrative window." Krail inclined his head in the gracious style of someone who has just won. Of course. The session adjourned. I watched the human delegation file out. Not a single elevated stress indicator. No tightening of the facial muscles their species uses to signal distress. No accelerated movement. The junior members were, I noted with some bafflement, speaking to each other in low voices, with what I could only classify as the sonic markers of amusement. "Medical emergency," Velm murmured beside me. "They must be in shock. Sometimes extreme distress in humans presents as..." "Velm." "Yes, Senior S. Sarath." "They're laughing." He considered this. Perhaps it's a coping mechanism. Perhaps. I watched Elinor Voss reach the corridor door. She did not look back at Krail. She did not look back at the chamber at all. She walked with that same quality I had noticed at Gate 17. A woman passing through a moment she had already accounted for, moving toward the next one. The door closed. I stayed in my seat for longer than protocol required. The 72 hours passed. The human delegation resubmitted with the updated annexes. The second session opened. Krail raised a jurisdictional challenge, a genuine and well-prepared one this time, supported by 40 years of Dravosi territorial documentation, 17 precedent citations, and a surprisingly elegant legal argument that the Seavith corridor had never formally been designated as open claim territory under the Conclave's original charter. It was, I will admit, impressive work. It was also the kind of work that takes 40 years to build, which meant Krail had been constructing this particular weapon since before several of the human delegations, junior members had been born. Alina Voss listened to the full presentation without interrupting. When Krail finished, she asked 2 questions. Both were clarifying questions, not challenges, not objections, just the kind of procedural questions you ask when you want to make sure you've understood something correctly. Then she said, "We'd like to request a 10-day recess to review the precedent documentation." "Granted," said the session chair. The session adjourned. In the corridor afterward, I fell into step beside Alina Voss. Not by accident. I had timed it. She glanced sideways at me, and there was something in the glance that suggested she had timed it too. "That's a considerable setback," I offered. She made a small sound. "Is it?" "The jurisdictional argument is strong. I've read Drevosi territorial filings for 40 years. Krail built that case carefully." "He did," she agreed. "And yet..." She smiled. Not a diplomatic smile. Those I know, I have deployed thousands of them. They live in a specific set of muscles and go nowhere near the eyes. This was something else. This was the smile of a person who has been asked a question they find genuinely interesting. "Ambassador S. Sarath," she said, "how old are you?" 321, I said. She nodded as though I'd confirmed something. "How many diplomatic careers have you watched begin and end in that time?" I considered hundreds. "And of those, how many species, when they lost an early procedural challenge, came back stronger 40 years later?" I opened my mouth, closed it. She kept walking. I stayed where I was for a moment, watching her go, and I had the distinct and unsettling sensation of a person who has been looking at an image for a long time and has just, for the first time, understood what it actually depicts. The 10-day recess had a particular texture to it, the specific quality of a held breath. Krail's delegation moved through the spire with the quiet confidence of people who believe the work is already done. The human delegation moved through it the way they had moved through everything else, calmly, unhurriedly, in small clusters of 2 and 3, speaking to each other in voices too low to catch. I caught Velm outside the human delegation's working room on the 4th day, pressing his sensory filaments closer to the door than was professionally appropriate. I said his name. He straightened immediately. I was just. "You were just." He fell into step beside me, managing to look simultaneously embarrassed and unrepentant in a way that reminded me, painfully, of myself at his age. "I can hear them," he said, "inside the working room." And he was quiet for a moment. "They don't sound like a delegation reviewing precedent documentation." "What do they sound like?" His crest moved in the uncertain, almost diffident way it moves when he's not sure how something will land. "They sound like people who are winning." I looked at the door. "Yes," I said, "they do." On the 8th day of the recess, I requested a private meeting with Alina Voss. She agreed without hesitation, which itself told me something. She named a time, a location, one of the spire's smaller observation rooms, a curved alcove of transparency looking out into the asteroid's interior atrium, where the hydroponic tiers dropped away in stacked green rings for 300 meters. And when I arrived, she was already there, standing at the glass with her hands folded behind her back. I took up a position beside her, and we were both quiet for a moment looking at the atrium. "You wanted to ask me something," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Several things." She inclined her head. "I have read your file," I said. "You spent 11 years in hardship postings before your advisory career, species in crisis, negotiations with no clear path to resolution, the kinds of assignments that most diplomats try to avoid." "Yes," she finished. "I requested them." I looked at her. Her profile against the atrium light was composed and attentive. Her hands hadn't moved. "Why?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. "When I was 22 years old," she said, "I attended a lecture by a woman named Priya Chandrasekharan. She was 91 at the time, very old for us, very near the end. She had spent 68 years in galactic diplomatic work. She told a room full of young attachés something I have never forgotten. I waited. She said, "You will be dead before any of the things you build are finished. Every species you encounter has had longer to build their obstacles than you have had to build your responses. The only advantage you will ever have is that you know this, and they don't. Plan accordingly." The atrium light shifted, one of the spire's periodic cycle adjustments, dimming and re-brightening in a slow wash of amber. The hydroponic tiers below us glowed briefly gold. "What did she mean," I asked, "by plan accordingly?" Elinor Voss turned to look at me for the first time since I'd entered the room. Her eyes, in the amber light, were very steady. "She meant," she said, "that a species that knows it dies young builds differently than one that expects to live forever. You build for continuity. We build for completion. We don't start things we expect to see finished. We start things we expect to hand off. Every loss is a position. Every concession is a thread left in the wall for the next pair of hands to pull." I was quiet for a long time. The 40 years it took Krail to build his jurisdictional argument, I said slowly. She smiled. "We've had people studying that argument for 38 of them." On the 10th day, the session reconvened. Krail presented his documentation with the same clinical precision he had brought to every previous session. The same immaculate file order, the same unhurried delivery, the same 40 years of carefully constructed precedent stacked in sequence like stones in a wall. Elinor Voss waited until he was entirely finished. Then she opened a single document on the surface before her and said, "We'd like to respond to the jurisdictional challenge." The session chair indicated she should proceed. What followed took 11 minutes. I counted. Velm, beside me, had stopped breathing somewhere around the 3-minute mark, and I noted this with the distant portion of my attention that was not fully occupied by what I was watching unfold across the table. The human delegation did not attack Krail's precedent citations. They didn't dispute the jurisdictional argument at all. What Elinor Voss laid out, in the specific unhurried voice of someone reading a thing they have known for a very long time, was a secondary charter amendment, filed 31 years ago, passed in a session Krail had not attended, buried in a supplementary archive that technically existed, but that no active delegation had cited in over 2 decades, that had quietly reclassified the entire category of territorial designation that Krail's argument depended on. His 40 years of precedent cited territory law as it existed before the amendment. The amendment made his entire argument structurally irrelevant. Not wrong, not illegal, irrelevant. As if someone had spent 40 years building an immaculate case for why a particular door could not be opened, and a human had quietly, 31 years ago, installed a second door in the adjacent wall. Krail was very still. The session chamber was very still. Elinor Voss folded her hands on the table. "We're prepared to move forward with substantive territorial discussion," she said, "whenever the session chair is ready." Velm found me afterward at the observation window, the same window where I had watched the humans arrive. Gate 17 below us was quiet now, the umbilical corridor empty, the receiving hall cycling through its post-session cleaning protocol. He stood beside me for a while without speaking. This is new for him. He is learning slowly that some things need to settle before they need to be discussed. "The amendment," he said finally. "It was filed 31 years ago." "Yes." Elinor Voss is 43. "Yes." She was 12 years old when it was filed. I said nothing. He was quiet again. When he spoke, his voice had the specific quality it gets when he is assembling something for the first time, fitting pieces together with the careful attention of someone who wants to get the shape exactly right. "Someone filed it for her," he said, before she was in the work at all. Someone who knew they wouldn't be there for the session where it would matter. Someone who just left the thread in the wall, I said. He turned to look at me. It's what they do, I said. They don't build things they expect to see finished. They build things they expect to hand off. Below us, the umbilical corridor cycled its atmosphere. A Gret Holly maintenance crew moved through the receiving hall in their unhurried single file, attending to surfaces, checking seals, doing the long, unglamorous work that keeps a station running. Velm's crest moved in the small, slow way it moves when something has genuinely reached him. Not the reactive lift of surprise, but the longer, settling movement of a thing landing in a place it intends to stay. That's terrifying, he said. I considered the empty corridor. Thought about a woman who was 91 when she gave a lecture to a room full of young attachés. Thought about one young woman in that room who remembered it for 21 years and then spent her career building something she would hand to hands she hadn't met yet. Thought about Crail, who had spent 40 years building a wall around a door that no longer existed. Yes, I said. It is. I found Elinor Voss in the Spire's Eastern Transit Corridor 2 hours later. She was alone, moving at the same unhurried pace she had maintained from Gate 17 onward, a flat document case tucked under one arm, watching the asteroid's interior light shift through the observation panels as she walked. I fell into step beside her. She didn't look surprised. We walked for a moment in the quiet that had developed, somewhere over the past 10 days, into a comfortable thing. The amendment, I said. Who filed it? She glanced sideways at me. Her expression was the interested, faintly warm one I was beginning to recognize as her version of openness. A woman named Josephine Adami, she said. She retired 4 years after filing it. She passed away 9 years ago. Did she know what it would be used for? Elinor was quiet for a moment. She knew the category of thing it could be used for. She didn't know the specific case. She couldn't have. She saw a gap in the architecture, filled it, trusted that someone eventually would know what to do with it. She died 9 years ago. Yes, she never knew she won. Elinor stopped walking. I stopped beside her. She turned to look at me fully. The same steady look from the observation room. The same eyes that in any light seemed to be focused on something slightly further away than the immediate moment. She knew she built something that would last, Elinor said. That's not the same as losing. I thought about that for the length of time it takes to take 3 slow breaths. I thought about 321 years of diplomatic work, the treaties I had built carefully with my own hands and watched hold, the ones I had built carefully with my own hands and watched fracture. How much of what I built was built to last, and how much was built to be finished. How often I had confused those two things. You'll forgive me for saying, I said, that your species frightens me considerably more than it did this morning. Elinor Voss smiled, the real one, not the diplomatic one. Good, she said. She tucked the document case more securely under her arm and kept walking. I stayed where I was. Behind me, somewhere deep in the Spire's administrative levels, Crail was presumably reviewing what had happened in the session chamber with the specific quality of attention a person brings to something they cannot quite believe is as broken as it appears to be. In front of me, Elinor Voss rounded a corridor bend and was gone. And somewhere, in an archive, in a filing system, in a secondary charter supplement that no active delegation had cited in decades, there were almost certainly other threads left in other walls by other hands that had long since gone still. Waiting for the next pair. Waiting as long as it took.